Hi, my name is Bob Dankert from Envision IT.
And I'm Brandon Belman from Envision IT.
Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about building microapps for SharePoint using Power Automate as middleware. Really excited to be talking about this, and I'm glad you're spending some of your time to join us with this adventure. Today, we're going to start by doing a brief overview of what everything is. We're going to be building a change management process using Power Automate, which is a Microsoft tool, Microsoft Power Automate, formerly Microsoft Flow. Got renamed about a year ago. Um, and we're going to be storing our data in SharePoint as the system of record, or SOR, in case you see that acronym. You've probably seen it lots of times by now. And this is a no-code solution. I really love this solution because even though we're using SharePoint on the back end, this allows us to have SharePoint without the SharePoint. Users aren't interfacing with SharePoint once this is fully implemented. They're going to be creating and updating and responding to records, change requests that are stored in SharePoint, but they're actually going to be interfacing with them through the Citrix Workspace environment. I really love that part of this. When we're done talking about what we're going to be building, we're going to do a hands-on building of everything, setting up the SharePoint list, registering the Azure app, going through a number of tools, Postman, Pipedream, Power Automate, Graph API, and the integration and Microapp in the Citrix Workspace. Once we're done with that, we're going to do a live demo of using it so you can see how it works. The hands-on of building everything is going to be screen captures, and we're going to talk through all those things just to keep this sped up a little bit so we're not taking too much time. Again, both Brandon and I come from a company called Envision IT. We're both from the software engineering team at Envision. Envision is a platinum Citrix solution advisor and service provider located in the Midwest in the United States. We're the preferred technology partner for organizations that value employee engagement and recognize that people and technology together drive business success. We've been working with Microapps for the past year or so. It's been very exciting seeing the technology evolve and offer so many more capabilities throughout this last year, especially webhook support that got added earlier this year in June or July, I think that was. All right, I can't give a talk on IT or development related stuff without including an XKCD comment. This is kind of related to our change management. I'll give you a second to read through this. So if you're not familiar with change management, this is an important concept. If you're a software developer, you've probably used systems like Jira or Trello to handle change management within your code. However, change management is needed within many other parts of a business, including like IT systems management is very common to have change management. We've often found many enterprises have a process similar to what we're going to show you today to handle their change management using lists in SharePoint. In fact, that's where we came up with this, is we were working with one of our clients who uses Citrix Workspace and was looking for a better solution rather than having their users working with this their current change management process in SharePoint. Quick overview of what this is going to look like. I say quick, I guess this is pretty detailed. So let me zoom in here to make this a little bit easier to read. So as I mentioned, we are going to be creating and updating all of our records within the Citrix Workspace environment. So every time we create or update that record, that is going to fire the Microsoft Graph API, which is going to add or update that record into SharePoint. So we're using the Graph API that gets fired from the event getting created in the workspace that adds it into SharePoint, into the system of record. Once that gets added into the system of record, Power Automate is watching for changes to this particular list where our change requests reside. And it's going to receive notification anytime there's a new record, and it is going to fire an HTTP request that's going to feed that data into our Microapp integration via webhooks. So that is how we are populating our data. So starting here, employee creates a new change request in Workspace that fires the Graph API to create the new record. Moving on down, Power Automate receives notification of this change request and feeds that updated data into our Microapp integration via webhooks. And as soon as there is a new change request, it is now going to go into the approval process. So we have a multi-approval workflow that we're creating here for this change request. It could be used for much more than just change request as well. It doesn't have to be a change request process, but in this case, it's just a multi-approval workflow. So after a change request has been received, it requires pre-approval from a distinct group of users. After pre-approval, it requires final approval from another group of users. And after final approval, it will go back to the creator. So in this case, the new change request requires pre-approval. Notification is going to show up in the Citrix Workspace for the pre-approval users, indicating that there's a new change request awaiting pre-approval. They get to review the request, decide whether they want to approve it or reject it. And approving it or reject it is going to update the request in SharePoint using the Microsoft Graph API. Once that happens, it's going to send an email to the request creator to let them know whether it was approved or rejected. Again, because the record was updated in SharePoint, it is going to Power Automate is going to get notification of that and update our record in the Microapp integration in the Citrix environment via the webhook. If it was pre-approved, then we continue on down this process. If it was rejected, then that's sort of the end of this. The person who created the request can take a look at it and figure out why it was rejected and make any changes if they need to and resubmit it. So assuming it was pre-approved, that now requires final approval. So notification will show up for the final approval users, and they get to review the request and any notes that were put in there and decide whether they want to give final approval to this, to approve or reject it. Regardless if they approve or reject it, it will update the record in SharePoint and send an email to the creator of the request, just like we did previously. And that will again continue on down. Power Automate receives notification of the final approval or rejection and feeds that data into the Microapp integration via webhook. If it did receive final approval, it then continues on down to go back to the creator of the change request so that they can confirm implementation. So at this point in time, it is back, this has been assigned back to them. And as soon as they've implemented it, they can record their implementation in the workspace environment. And that will update the record in SharePoint via the Graph API. Power Automate receives notification, and it updates everything else all over again. So we are going to go through the process of what it takes to set this up in your environment. Brandon's going to walk us through this. So we're going to be starting with step one, building the SharePoint and setting up the list for that. So Brandon, you're going to take us into this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bob. So as he mentioned, we are going to start in SharePoint, which is our system of record. We will begin by creating a new list in SharePoint. This is where we are going to store and update our change management records. To start, we click the New button and select List. We'll create a blank list and then give it a name that fits the process that we would like to track. For the purposes of our example, we are going to use the name Change Management. The first column we will add to our list is Request Status as a single line of text. The value in this column is how we track the progress of any individual request in our Microapp. The additional columns added here, such as Pre-Approval Reviewer and Final Approval Date, are optional, but will provide better context once we are working with the data in Microapps. Feel free to add as many or as few columns here as you would like in order to track the changes that you're making. Once we have completed creating our SharePoint list, we'll add an item to the list, right-click on it, and then we'll select Copy Link from the options, and we'll record this value for later. This is the first of several values that we will record for later. So it could be helpful to have a notepad or an Excel document, something open.
Yep.
Yeah, Visual Studio Code, something open so that you could copy several items because we will be using them later.
Yep, a lot of things to copy and paste. And as Brandon mentioned, This, you can add whatever fields you want. You'll be able to, we'll show you how to link up those fields in the Citrix Workspace Microapp that we're going to be creating, and how we can feed that into SharePoint using the Graph API.
Yep. So once we have our list set up, the next thing to do is move on to Azure Active Directory app registration. So in order for the Microapp integration to have access to SharePoint and send emails to users to notify them of the status of their request, we must register our application under our Azure Active Directory tenant. When you log into Azure Active Directory, you can find app registrations in the left menu.
And you might not have access to your Azure AD interface. If you don't, you'll just talk to your IT department and get access. In fact, maybe they'll even make a change request for that.
That's a good point. Thank you. So once we are in app registrations, you'll want to hit select a new registration. And we enter a name that best fits our integration. Here, we're also adding a redirect URI for Postman, as we will be using Postman soon to help us gather essential information for connecting our integration to the proper SharePoint list.
And Postman always uses the same URL, so if you can see that on the screen, you can copy the same value. Or within Postman, it will give you the value that you can use for OAuth authentication, and you can copy that URL there.
Once our app has been registered, we copy the application ID. We can also click the Endpoints button that has the globe icon up towards the top of the page. From there, we will see an expanded window come from the right, and that contains different endpoint URIs. And in that, we will copy the v2 variations of the OAuth 2.0 authorization and OAuth 2.0 token endpoints. We'll save those for later. Next, we will move on to API permissions in the left menu. Here we want to select to add permissions. That will also expand a box from the right. And we will have an option to select Microsoft Graph API, and then we will have an option to select application permissions or delegated. For our purposes, we are going to be using delegated permissions. For our application, we will need to search in the list and find mail.send and sites.readwrite.all. Once those have been added to the API permissions, we are going to go to certificates and secrets in the menu on the left.
Yeah, and real quick, just to add, if you're changing this process a little bit, the Microsoft Graph API is really well documented. And when you're adding these permissions, you'll see a lot of the different functionalities that it's able to perform. So it's interesting to take a look at that stuff and think about some of the ways that you could customize this process to perform other actions, similar to how we're describing it today.
Over in certificates and secrets, we generate a new client secret and we give it a descriptive name. You can select the amount of time you would like it to expire in, if you'd like it to expire at all. And once we have added that client secret, we need to make sure that we copy the value after we hit add, because once we leave this page, the value cannot be retrieved again. You would have to delete the secret and add a new one in order to copy a new secret. Once this has been completed, we can move on to Postman, though we will be coming back to our Azure app registration later.
Yeah, and if you do choose to expire it in 1 year or 2 year, it's a great idea to make sure you put a calendar notification so that you can make sure you update this in your system before it actually expires. Otherwise, you're going to find out in 1 year or 2 that it's going to stop working, and you'll have some unhappy users. All right, so moving on, next step 3, we're going to be working with a number of tools, Postman, Pipedream, and the Microsoft Graph API. Oh my.
So here we are in Postman. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Postman, Postman is a free software that allows you to make and customize HTTP requests. We will be making 2 requests to our SharePoint instance in order to gather the site ID and the relevant list ID. We will use the application ID and the application secret, also known as the client ID and the client secret. that we retrieved from the Azure AD app registration. We use those in order to get a token to make calls to the Microsoft Graph API.
And if you haven't used Postman before, Postman is a tool. You can download it for free, as Brandon said, and it installs a program that will run on your computer on the desktop.
It's extremely handy.
Yeah.
So the first call that we're going to make is a call to search for the SharePoint site that our list is stored on. We create a GET request in Postman using the Microsoft Graph API to search the sites and click Send to execute the request. We find our SharePoint site in the results, and we are going to record the second value under the list ID for the site in question.
Yeah, that's a yellow value here in the middle.
Yep. For our second request, we're going to take that copied value and provide it in the URL up at the top. And when we do this, we are retrieving a list of all of the lists that are stored at that site ID. Once we make that request, we will get all of our lists in the results. You will search for the list that you're looking for and copy the ID value there. Next, we're going to move on out of Postman, and we are going to use a new tool. It's called PipeDream to capture the body of an update to the SharePoint list. PipeDream allows you to create endpoints and that you can send HTTP calls to, among other things. Additionally, PipeDream allows you to write code to process what you receive. So we start by creating a new source.
Yeah, so if you haven't used PipeDream before, this has taken over what was RequestBin. So if you now go to requestbin.com, it is now a PipeDream product. And this is a web tool. You get there at pipedream.com. You can also use other request bins. We just particularly like PipeDream because it has a lot of other functionalities that we find pretty exciting and interesting.
So once we select source, we select create the type of source, we create event source.
Yep. So as I said, this allows you to create an endpoint very similar to RequestBin. You can use one of those other RequestBin tools as well.
Once we are creating our source and setting our options, we want to select HTTP as our app and HTTP as our source. We can name our source however we like, give it something descriptive to help us out, and click Create. Once we click Create, PipeDream will provide us with an endpoint URI where we can send HTTP requests to in order to parse the event.
So just want to go ahead and copy that endpoint, and we've blacked out a lot of fields. I'm sure you've noticed it already. Just anything potentially sensitive we've blacked out, but you'll want to copy that value and keep note of that.
So moving on to Power Automate, we create a new automated flow. We select the SharePoint option for when an item is created or modified. Here in the flow editor, we are going to first select our site from the list of SharePoint sites, and then we are going to select our list from the list of lists on our SharePoint site. The next thing we do is we are going to add an HTTP step to the flow. We set the method to post and ensure we are attaching the SharePoint body. Here we provide the URL given to us by PipeDream, and then we save the flow.
It's worth mentioning, if you haven't used Power Automate before, they have a couple different license options. In order to use the HTTP action that Brandon has showed us here, that does require the premium license with Microsoft Power Automate. Something to be aware of.
They do have a free trial as well.
Yep.
After saving the flow, you'll want to go back to SharePoint and add an item to the list. This will trigger the flow and send the body on to the PipeDream source that we've created.
Yeah, so we're just doing this so we're creating the record manually in SharePoint here so that it will make sure that our Power Automate flow is working. and as well so we can capture the body that's being sent. That's going to help us with setting up the Microapp integration.
So over in the Pipedream workflow, we can see an event has populated on the left. We select it, we select the post call, and then we want to switch the view of the data to pretty. We can then scroll down and look for the body key in the data, which will contain our JSON body. We select and copy the entire value of the body key, intentionally excluding the body tag itself. We'll copy the entire value, starting with the initial curly brace and scrolling down to the closing curly brace. We record the body of this response, and that is all we actually need from Pipedream.
Yep. So once we've copied that out, if you're not sure, if you don't work with JSON often, and this value that we're copying here is a JSON value. If you want to validate that this is correct, you can use an online tool like jsonlint.com. That's JSONLINT.com, where you can just paste it in and click validate to make sure that you did copy everything correctly. It'll check and let you know if you have a valid JSON object or not.
Moving on, step 4, we're moving into the Citrix Workspace backend. We're going to do the integration configuration. So under Microapp integrations, we click to add a new integration, and we are going to select to create it from an HTTP web service. Once we do that, we are immediately shown the options for configuring the integration, and we start by providing the Microsoft Graph API base URL and setting the authentication method to OAuth 2.0 and the grant type to authorization code. We are going to record the callback URL that the integration has provided for us here for use later.
Yep. And now this is a pretty long page. We're going to scroll on down.
Yep. Next, we're going to set token authorization to authorization header and put the authorization URL we recorded from our Azure AD app registration. We also provide the token URL retrieved from the app registration. The scope here correlates to the permissions that were allocated in the app registration, presented in a URL format and separated by a space. We enter the client ID and the client secret, or the application ID and application secret, that we retrieved from our app registration as well. Continuing to scroll down, we will toggle the Use Separate User Authentication and Actions option to display the service action authentication settings. Here we provide the same values for all of the fields that we did previously. And again, we are going to save the callback URL that is provided to us here.
Yep. This is where we're starting to really copy a lot of different values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Once you want to save that, and then we are going to move back to the Azure Active Directory app registration and update the redirect URIs. So back in the Azure app registration, we can select add a redirect URI from the app overview page. You could also reach the page we're looking for by selecting the authentication tab on the left. On this interface, we are going to add the 2 callback URLs under the redirect URLs section. And these are the URLs that we just collected from the integration configuration in our Microapp. We can remove the Postman callback URL now, as it is no longer needed. We want to make sure we click Save to apply these changes.
Yep. It can be kind of tricky. Each of these interfaces has a different spot for the save. So sometimes you're going up, sometimes you're looking down, etc. But it's kind of sad if you forget to save that.
Once we've done that, we are done with our app registration. We can move back to the Citrix Workspace backend and start configuring our Microapp. So after saving the changes to the Azure Active Directory app registration, we are going to return to the integration configuration, and we want to click Reauthorize here to log into our Azure Active Directory tenant. And this will authorize our integration. And now we have to set up a variety of things in the integration itself before we move on to configuring the microapps. The first thing that we're going to set up is a data endpoint, although we actually do not actively use the data endpoint in our integration. The data endpoint is required in order to set up the webhook, which we do need. We have been utilizing a basic call to the list to acquire list items. And here is the first location where we provide the site ID and list ID that we recorded from our Postman calls. Once we provide those items, we select Generate Tables at the bottom and click Fetch JSON Structure from API to populate the text area with the JSON body as a result of the call being executed. The shape of this table is not very important, though we do have to edit the table to select ID as a primary key before we can save the data endpoint settings. After saving the data endpoint, we want to set up our webhook listener by selecting webhook listeners on the left. We'll add a new one and we'll name our webhook and record the URL that is provided to us here. When authorization method is set to token, a token is provided, and we can record this value and set the token to be read from the authorization header and prefix it with bearer. Under Generate Tables, here we will provide the body that was retrieved from our Pipedream event source and name our table list entries. We paste in the JSON value retrieved from Pipedream into the sample request, and we'll select a name for our table and click Generate. We edit the table and set ID as the primary key. We'll ignore any items here that are not related to the function of our list. We can also rename JSON properties here so that items imported will appear under the column name we provide in the resulting table. We save our changes and we'll save the webhook. After configuring our webhook, we need to configure several service actions to perform the changes on the SharePoint list and send emails. Click Add Service Action will bring up the service action configuration. In order to enable the integration to send emails and update the list in SharePoint, we are going to have to provide several service action parameters so that things will populate in the calls as we need them. Here we are providing the email of the reviewer, the date, and the ID of the item to be updated. We are also making all of these parameters required.
Yeah, and as we talked about earlier, you can add additional fields if needed. So this would be one of those places you could add some of those additional fields. And in order to save time, instead of going through pre-approval and final approval, we're just going to show you how some of this stuff goes. And then you're going to also apply those for the additional steps in your workflow that you're going to be setting up, like final approval and implementation.
So for this particular call, we need to use patch to make the call to the SharePoint list and update the item there. We add the Microsoft Graph API path that allows us to update list items. We provide the site ID and the list ID that we recorded from Postman, and we also use the action parameter for the list ID that will also populate in the URL. For all of these calls, we also have to provide and configure a JSON body. The structure for these JSON objects can be found in the Microsoft Graph API documentation for the relevant call. We utilize the property names from the JSON body retrieved from Pipedream to ensure that our updates are inserted into the proper columns in the SharePoint list. Here we are also using parameters to pass the values from the Microapp into the JSON body. Calls for sending emails also make use of service action parameters. So here we have another service action, and this one is just to send an email to the creator of the request, telling them that it has been pre-approved. We are making use of the reviewing user's email address, the title of the entry, any comments that were provided by the reviewer, and the email for the user who submitted the initial request. Notice that the comments parameter is the only one not required, and an empty string has been provided as the default value. We provide the Graph API URL for sending email, and we insert the email of the current user, that is the reviewing user. We get the JSON body structure from the Microsoft Graph API docs for sending emails, and we replace values for the recipients as well as the approver's name, provided here as the acting user's email address, and we attach any comments provided as well. We repeat these steps to create service actions for final approve, reject, send final approve email, send rejection email. Additionally, we have added services for creating a change form, which is adding an item to a list, and confirming the implementation of approved changes. Once we have finished authorizing the integration, setting up the webhook and service actions, we can finally move on to adding microapps to our integration. So within our new microapp, under Pages, the first page we want to create is the pre-approval page. This will display information imported from our webhook and allow the subscribing user to pre-approve or reject a request. When we set up the page, we can display any information from the webhook table that we would like. Currently, we are using the page to display the title, creator, and the date it was created. We also provide a link so that the reviewing user can see the item directly in SharePoint. We do this by adding a go-to URL action on the field, and we provide the link that we copied from SharePoint all the way back at the beginning of this process. We replace the ID in the URL with the curly brackets and the name of the parameter in the table so that it can insert the ID of the item being reviewed directly into the link. For each button, we assign 2 service actions. So the pre-approve button has the pre-approve action and the send pre-approved email action. We must edit the parameters for each of these actions so that the proper values are provided for the service action. The second page created for this microapp is a table that displays submissions awaiting pre-approval or rejection. We select to show the columns created by, and the title of the entry. We add a service action to the table so that each row in the table will link to the pre-approval page for the corresponding list entry. The table filter is set to only show items that have a null request status, meaning that the items in this list have not been rejected, pre-approved, final approved, or implemented as of yet.
Yep, and we're just creating these tables so that in addition to getting the notifications about when you have an action to perform, you can also click that table and view a list of everything that's still waiting for the pre-approval or final approval or implementation. That way, if you were to accidentally dismiss one of the notifications, you can still get to that record from within the table of items.
Yep. So next we'll set up a notification in our microapp so that people who are subscribed to this microapp can receive those notifications when an item's been submitted and is pending pre-approval. We make sure the table the notification is monitoring is the list entries table created by our webhook. We name the notification, and we use a similar process with the curly braces and the name of the property in our webhook table in order to insert the value into the notification. In our example here, we're using the submitter's name and the title of their submission. We also want to set the action for our notification to the pre-approved page so that when somebody selects the notification, it will display the pre-approved page with the corresponding data. We configure the notification settings to display when request status is equal to null and expire the notification when request status is no longer null or the underlying data is no longer stored in the webhook table. Lastly, we name our microapp, select an icon, and set the action to open the table that displays items pending pre-approval. We repeated these steps for final approval and added a few more service actions and microapps for creating items in the list and confirming submission.
Yep. And on that previous page, you'd mentioned that we want to add those conditions for when to expire the notification. That's really important if you have multiple users who can pre-approve or final approve, so that if one of those users does pre-approve it, that the other users will no longer see that in their list of items that are waiting for pre-approval. We want to make sure that, if John Smith pre-approves a change request, that John Doe no longer sees that record.
Yes, exactly. And we'll also want to update the notification expiration and display conditions for, say, the final approval. So
Yep.
it will appear in the final approval list if it has been pre-approved,
Yep,
and it will disappear if it's not equal to pre-approved. So
Yep.
make sure when you're creating those pages and those notifications that you are setting up your filters properly for the step in the process that you're working within. So after we're setting up our service actions, creating our micro apps, we can subscribe users by clicking the ellipses in the integration list for the micro app and selecting subscribe. This makes the micro app available to those users so that it can be used from the workspace.
Yeah, so like we talked about, you can have a different group of users subscribed to the ability to create the change request and then a different group of users who can pre-approve it, a different group of users who can do final approval. For confirm implementation, you're going to want to register the same users that you selected for creating the change request form.
So moving on to the last step of setup, we are going to go back to Power Automate and update our flow with the integration webhook URL. Here it is exactly like the previous slide said. Now that we're done with our webhook, it's been configured. We want to update the URL here with the URL that was provided to us when we updated our webhook. We also want to add an authorization header, and for the value, we're going to put in bearer because that's what we added as our prefix in the configuration for the webhook URL, space, and then the token that was provided to us. Make sure to save it here, and now the setup process is complete.
Great. Thanks for taking us through all of that, Brandon. So now that we've gone through the process of what it's like to set up all of that stuff, we're going to launch into a live demo to show you what this looks like when we're actually using this. Now, with the notifications, when you're using Citrix Microapps in the workspace, there can be a little delay for the notifications. So we're going to have some light editing here just to cut out that delay while we're waiting for the notification to show up. It's usually not too long of a delay, but we just wanted to keep this nice and quick. So you're going to notice a slight, some edits here while we're waiting for that. All right, so now we're going to do a live demo of what this actually looks like. Now I'm using a user account who has access to create change requests, which we've called create change form. This user, just to simplify testing here, also has access to pre-approve their own requests, do final approval of their requests, and then of course, because they can create the change request, they can also confirm implementation of the change request. So we have called this the SharePoint Change Management. That is the name of our integration, and we're going to go ahead and start by creating a change request. So in this case, I'm just going to provide a title and ticket number. So I'm just going to give this a sample change request, and 8675309, submit. This goes through, pops up a box really quick. This is the OAuth that we are granting permissions to this. So as long as you stay logged in, you're only going to see that the first time that it's accessing and making that OAuth grant. So now, in just a moment, the notification is going to show up. All right, and we've received our notification. So now I am the pre-approval user, and I've received this notification that I am being asked to please review the change form sample change request. Bob Dankert, that is me, has submitted a change request. If I click this, it will open up the record. I can also click on change forms awaiting pre-approval, and this is going to display that table of items. I can also click on this to open up the request. So clicking either notification or this, they both open up the item. So at this point, we see those fields that we added to this page. We have the name of it, who it's created by, when it was created, a link. This is going to open it in SharePoint if you want to see that stuff. Looks great. Can't wait to see this change in our system. And I'm going to pre-approve it. So this is going to fire off that event through the Microsoft Graph API to approve it. You'll notice I didn't get a box this time for the OAuth authorization. And in just a moment here, we will get a notification in our system saying that there is a new item waiting for final approval. All right. And after submitting the pre-approval, it looks like we have now received notification that this sample change request is ready for final approval. So again, because I'm logged in as a user who has access to all three of these things, this now replaces the pre-approval one that we just pre-approved and indicates that we have a record waiting for final approval. So I'm going to open up the item. And I'm going to review this stuff, and again, just like we mentioned, you can put anything you want in here. So if you did want to see the pre-approval comments or any information about who pre-approved it, you can certainly put that information in here. In this case, we kept it very simple and easy to work with for the demonstration purposes. This looks fantastic. I can't spell. This looks great. Wow, always during a demo. Then I'm going to go ahead and click approved. And that will send this over to SharePoint and update this record. And in just a moment here, we're going to get another notification indicating that this record is now ready for final implementation. All right, so we have now received our confirm implementation notification. So this is what happens after a change request receives its final notification. It goes back to the creator of the change request to confirm implementation. And it's worth mentioning that emails have also been sent out at each step saying that it was pre-approved and it received final approve. That email went to the user who created the change request. So again, we can click this item to go ahead and go into this. And we also have a list of those items that are waiting for confirmed implementation. So again, if you have just a lot of notifications and it's hard to keep track of this stuff, you always have these buttons on the side that can display a list of all items that are waiting for you. Or if you were to dismiss the notification and need some way to get back to it. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and click that we've confirmed implementation. Again, you could customize this if you needed to add more fields or options, etc. After we click confirm implementation, the record has gone away. And at this point, that is the end of this change request. It was created in the Citrix Workspace environment, received pre-approval, received final approval, and confirmed implementation of that, all within the environment here. So I'm gonna switch interfaces here and get us back. All right, so now that we've gone through that live demo, I just want to give a few closing thoughts. So in summary, we've created that full change management system. One of my favorite parts about this solution is this is SharePoint without the SharePoint. No one really liked, at least I don't like going into SharePoint. I'm not a big fan of it. I don't use it very often. It's mostly for lists of things like this. So this is a great way if you're also using SharePoint in a similar way like this, where you have a lot of users who aren't commonly going into SharePoint, but you have certain processes that utilize SharePoint, like change management, or it even could be an office tracking log if you want to keep track of who's going into the office and when they're going into the office, which in times like this during the pandemic is certainly important information to have. SharePoint gives you an easy way to be able to set up those lists of data, but not always a great experience when users need to log into SharePoint, find the right list, find the right items, use the SharePoint interfaces, and it doesn't have events, etc. So this implements a lot. This makes it a much nicer experience while still using the same backend system. We talked about how we used Power Automate as a middleware to build a no-code solution. So it's updating our Citrix Workspace environment with the data coming into SharePoint. And using similar tooling to what we've built, if you're looking for even more power, we've built similar type things like this that have even more functionality and capabilities in this using Pipedream. We used Pipedream previously just to capture those requests coming in. But Pipedream also has functionality where it allows you to have control flow within that, where you can say, when this happens, then do this, then this. It's kind of like an if this, then that. Except the beautiful thing about Pipedream is it allows you to run code in response. So you can manipulate and alter the chain of what happens to your data that's going into Pipedream. So it's like Power Automate, but with code that runs in a serverless environment. Thanks a lot for joining us again. My name is Bob Dankert, and with the software engineering team over at Envision, and joined here by
Brandon Belman. Thank you very much.
Yep. Take care.